Okay, I'm probably preaching to the choir, right? In this setting. If you don't believe this, then it's just a big waste of my time. Or maybe it's worthwhile. It's worth my time. But anyway, I'm going to speak to the value and the importance of having ASL literature in the hopes of encouraging more ASL literature production. I think that's critical, the creation of ASL literature, because currently we don't have enough. There is some out there, but clearly we have more to do in this area. So hopefully this will inspire some of you. I know I have very little time, so I better start with my talk. First, I want to speak to just literature in general. It's a mirror of society. Most societies have a belief in some sort of literature that can pass on stories, and through the storytelling process and literature process, you pass on information to members of the society, and it's an insight into the community thinking, their cultural beliefs, and a variety of other attributes of a culture. So literature is a mirror of society. And talking about literature, I'm going to focus on various layers. One layer will focus on patterns and rhythm and structure of the human language, just in general, for the purposes of teaching children nursery rhymes. And then I'll talk about the awareness of poetry and narratives and storytelling, so that we can take a look at a deep level into the values and beliefs of a society. So this is a layered look at literature. And this is the order that I'm going to focus on certain things. First, I'll start with nursery rhymes. I'll talk about poetry. And I'll end up lastly talking about narratives. So first, nursery rhymes. This picture here is a picture of me when I was a young boy. My parents were deaf, but my mother was more hard of hearing and she could speak rather well. And she enjoyed reading to us, nursery rhyme books to us when I was a young person. And I remember, not being able to hear, sitting there with my sister. And so my mother would turn the page and read the nursery rhymes. I can't remember the words or the stories. However, I do recall well the pattern that I noticed. Sitting on the lap and just having a feeling come through of her reading the stories and looking at her, having various ways of pronouncing things and therefore generating a rhythm. Again, I couldn't understand the words, but I certainly got a sense of the pattern. And from that, I developed an understanding of nursery rhyme patterns, even though she was speaking. At that point, I realized that there are layers of patterns with the syllabus, the structures, the sonority, how things are said, how loud, how soft. You get a sense of all of that when engaging and listening to nursery rhymes. Now let me apply this to ASL nursery rhymes. They're very comparable. You'll see patterns in signed nursery rhymes. You'll see long and short movements. You'll say like a week, short week, or a long week. You can say use the sign always and modify it according to the message you're trying to send, the pattern, the placement, the location, the repeated moments. All of these are embedded into nursery rhymes, and it helps us develop language faculty for understanding the nursery rhymes. And so these are acquired patterns. And so you do get a sense of the rhythm of the nursery rhyme from all these different layers. Now, in nursery rhymes, you have the VL2. There's BL2, the brain linguistical assessment. That's a current study in development of patterns, the capture of movements, motion capture using technology. Also, they use eye patterns to see using avatars to see how kids recognize the patterns, how they observe the patterns. And they are able to recognize it very young and continue that. And it's very similar to spoken nursery rhymes. There's parallels. And so now they're doing experiments on different frequencies and hertz. What's the rhythm? What's the information? And there's more work being done in this area. But there's been a lot of research on looking at young people's exposure to nursery rhymes and the patterns they pick up via the linguistic features of the language. There's also a motion lab over at Gallaudet. We have the brain development in Boston University, and so they're doing much more research in this area. And there's other people who are doing similar kinds of work all across the U.S. because, you know, it is our kids need to understand this, and we need to look at what are the features of it. I'll have different examples of videotapes that illustrate these points. Have you seen the ball story before? Some have not. You should. You should. It's mine, so therefore you should. It's my own production. However, I have different nursery rhymes that exhibit different types of patterns. The third category here was one that I came up with this morning. For the purpose of this presentation, I thought, why not? This is my current thinking, and I believe that I was sort of anticipating your questions. Now let's talk about the patterns you observed there. The goal is to expose kids to different movement patterns. One is the frequency, the repetitiveness of a certain pattern, and then one is the duration, the length of time. And so you saw that in that nursery rhyme with the play on signs. The open line was now, I live with 3 animals. And finally it says, I live with 3 animals, and that's it. Using the same hand shape, different movement, you know, it's from now to that. And so again, very similar, but it's a pattern, a form, a movement. And so this is the idea of a brief nursery rhyme, playing with locations, movement. I do foresee a question that you may ask me at the end of this. You know, it's important that kids get exposed to nursery rhymes, but you think about all those deaf kids who have hearing parents that don't know sign language and can't transmit these types of ASL stories and nursery rhymes. I anticipate your question, so I'm going to answer it now. But hearing parents know how to gesture, so they could create a rhythmic pattern using, you know, doing some sort of gesticulation. They could, you know, this idea of growing up and eating and drinking, eating and drinking as gestures. Crying is another common gesture. Smiling, reading, sleeping. So you can imagine that a hearing person could create a story. Let me see. Child growing up. Okay, let me start again. Child growing up, eating and drinking and eating and drinking and eating and drinking, and then grew up to be older, started crying and happy and smiling and crying and smiling. And as they got older, they started reading and sleeping, reading and sleeping, reading and sleeping. And as they got even older, now you can add sort of rhythm. Join me. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 1. Keep doing it. Okay, see the pattern? Going up. I would cheat. The other kid goes up, eats, sleeps, eats and drinks, eats and drinks. Yeah, eats and drinks, eats and drinks, eats and drinks. Grows up, get older, cries, smiles, cries and smiles, cries and smiles. Grows up, even older, reads and sleeps, reads and sleeps, reads and sleeps. You get it? very simple pattern, repetition though. And so hearing parents can take on, signs like sitting in chairs. It can be internalized. So there are possibilities of pattern, signing, gesticulation. They can use gestures to produce these same kind of patterns for the young deaf children. And so the basic idea of this is the need for the goal. I know some of you out there are very talented, or you have your own ideas. So I think more needs to be done. You need to participate in this study and contribute more to the ASL literature body.
ASL poetry. You would have a toolbox of ASL poets. If you open up the toolbox, what would you find? Well, you would find the language and linguistics, and for example, you'd have sign phonology, word senses, to images, the use of images and the juxtaposition of the images and moving or still or looking at the world and imitating that. For example, you've got land, mountains, you've got a lake, you've got a tree, you've got that whole scenery that flows smoothly from one scene to the next. And then a poet will be able to look at all of that sign production and create a beautiful masterpiece all in harmony. For example, Ella Mae Lentz, her poem was called The Circle of Life. Again, it's the play of the motion of circles, signing and moving in circles. I am so proud of the order, of superiority of the mimic you over speech. So understand, he's able to mimic life, the movement of life, and reproduce life. And that really is just superior in his mindset. So you have The Swan by Debbie Rennie. Debbie's a graduate of here, or RIT, so obviously her work is amazing. And then we have The Bird in the Cage by Alexander. It's beautiful, it's majestic. How she's able to incorporate the signing of the movement of the wings and coming down and settling down on land and moving its wings, and then obviously the feathers and everything in the beak. It's just amazing. It's just the imagery of it all. It just comes to life right before your eyes. And so again, for language to be able to produce that is amazing. That's what Berthier meant by it's superior than the spoke. You can't do that with a spoken language with speech. That's something that should be celebrated. We shouldn't, rather than, these people are gesturing or signing. No, it's awesome. It's awesome to celebrate that. Let's look at the next one. Gestures. Now, I believe the Russian, however you sign Russian, it's
the sign for sad is sad.
Sad is sad. He's giving you the description of being inside a cage, starting from the top all the way down in front of him and around the sides. So obviously, again, it's sad, the hand shape of sad with the actual bars of the cage. You're thinking, there's another, well, look, it's a play on words. It's the poetry. As you look at it closer, you can see all this. This is all visual. It's the gesture and the movement. Again, it's the concept of the roots of sign language. It really starts with gesturing, it's visual, and then later, over time, obviously sign language became conventional, and of course, it really was severed from its original roots, but as it really became and evolved more as a language that people can actually play, for example, charades, the game charades, you're familiar with that? But wait a minute. People say, well, you cheat. No, we're not cheating. Oh, no, you can't say that. And we start arguing back and forth. No, this is gesturing for drink. No, you just signed drink. That's the time for drink. You're like, oh, man, what do I do now? Well, so there's a line there between signing and gesturing. Obviously, this is internalized relative to the visual and the gesturing. Sign language is separate from that. So what I like to know is why? Why is this the case? Compare it with Ella, you know, with the circle of life, the greater and the deeper meaning of the circles that she was showing us. And then of course we saw the swan moving its leg, you know, its wings, and then its feet. And then is it at the same level as the bird of the cage? A little bit more in depth, but you can see. I mean, is this considered something that is of lower quality? No, I consider this of high, amazing quality. It's actually harder to think of something like this and to produce that type of work. But obviously, if you think about values, you've got values, and there's values of beauty. You got values of nature. We often say imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. So if I imitate someone, I imitate life. If I'm mimicking that, who am I flattering? Who am I flattering? Am I flattering the audience? Right, I'm flattering nature. I'm flattering God. I'm flattering the great one, whomever, the creator of everything. I'm mimicking, I'm flattering God. There's power in the work in and of itself. So that's really deep. I'm celebrating the beauty of nature. So you have poetry, and then we come to narratives. You've got your... So now we're at narratives, and of course narratives is certainly, you've got 3 acts, Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, Scene 1, Scene 2, Scene 3, introduction, actual action of what's taking place, and then the conclusion. It's pretty much the basic structure. You don't necessarily have to follow that, but in general, that's what takes place. Well, there are stories of the visual vernacular. For example, if you're watching a production of some signing, whatever, they may not have 3 exact scenes or acts. They may use classifiers and in the stories, but they don't have 3 full acts. Does that mean their narrative is inferior? No, it's a different type of experiment. It's not about sticking to the structure of 3 acts. It's how do you know, connect all the images and emotions together to make it flow, to make sure that it's close, just like you would edit a visual picture and cut out things and put it together. So it's the same way. ASL stories don't always have 3 acts, but hey, it's still, wow, beautiful, amazing. Classifier stories with 3 acts, you know, they'll be a little bit different, but people would look and see people signing using classifiers, and people would think, what's the point of the story? The story's not that great. You know, they make comments. It's like, wait a minute, time out. This is a different type of values here. You know, it's how you edit the story, edit and put things together and make it flow. And that's what's really amazing and wow. You know, the 3-act narrative is different in terms of what we're doing here. So I just want to throw that out for discussion. Visual, for vernacular, and classifier stories, you know. You know, you've got this all by itself, but although it can appear in an actual story or narrative. So narratives, you've got a wide range of narratives in terms of genre. You've got visual, vernacular, classifier stories, folklore. Folklore would be stories that's been passed down from generation to generation or passed among one another. Where does it start? What's the genesis of it? We really don't know. It could be many different things, but it's stories that have been passed down. We have no idea how it really started. You know, narratives are personal experiences, a slice of life, telling you about my experience. You know, giving you a little bit of insight in what's happening to me. You know, and then fictional narratives. And then, of course, life history, you know, the whole autobiography. And so these are the various narrative genres.
There are various stories, and they get passed from generation to generation. There's a lot of sharing that happens and a lot of entertainment value in them, but there's always a hidden meaning. What is the message? Is it teaching values? Is it teaching you world order? Is it teaching you about your place in society, your identity, whatever? You learn something from these stories, but at the same time, there's something implicit that you do take away from the narrative, the folklore. narratives of personal experiences, where deaf people share things that happened in real life. By sharing their personal experiences, there's topics around common deaf themes. You'll notice that. Also, when it comes to DVDs and videos, I've watched several when it comes to poetry and nursery rhymes, but with the personal experiences, there's many, many, many of them out there. Many that have been created, more than you'll find in nursery rhymes and poetry. But why is that? I wonder why there's more of that than nursery rhymes, and poems. Maybe it's sharing of one's deaf life. Maybe it allows you to be much more creative, but we're seeing so many more of these than the other categories I've talked about. The reason that being, my hypothesis is, well, it may be this. A sociologist named Hogarth noticed that in working class literature, it's very common that they discovered different patterns in working class literature. So those being an interest in the mundane everyday life, what happens to the average Joe. And also the story illustrates real life versus some sort of imaginary life or some fantasy. Not that they're trying to escape from their mundane life, but it just shows that this is so common. For example, the story of the hitchhiker, whether that was a real story that actually happened way back when, we don't know. It may be true, but the story has been passed on from generation to generation. And again, it's just an average day life of a regular Joe. Now, let's take a look closer at the deaf culture, deaf history. We're noticing now more and more deaf people are entering the middle class. But years ago, that was not that case. Most deaf people were working class individuals. And so maybe that's the reason why we saw many personal narratives, personal experiences in this type of folklore. It wasn't that you had to come up with something. You could share a story, something that was entertaining, something that was sad. And so you didn't have to take some creative fictional piece. You shared your real life experience. So we can talk more about fiction later, but I'm focusing on the personal experiences now. The last piece I'll talk about is in the past 25, 30 years, I've noticed more and more breaking from tradition and coming up with fictional narratives, stories to, create fictional works. For example, Birds of a Different Feather by myself. Based on a life experience and taking that and applying it in a different genre and applying it to the animal kingdom. So breaking away from the human story and applying it to an animal story. And then for a decent living, exploring the possibilities of breaking away from what is known and shifting to literary work, going from following life stories, personal stories, to fictional works. And I noticed that more and more of this is common. It's a genre of literature that is more prevalent. It's quite experimental and, breaking boundaries. I guess it's an evolution of deaf culture and the deaf community in general. And now we're entering the age of the digital media. It's out there. There's films and videos, DVDs, numerous. And there are people who produce these pieces. And now actually anybody can make one and you can post it. And whether it's good or bad work, you just post them and it's become ubiquitous. It's really a quick production. I think it all started with iMovies when iMovies came out. All of a sudden you realize, oh, on a home computer you can make your own video. You can, in the back in the old days, you had to go to a studio and use all the editing equipment, but now on your laptop, it's a mini studio. You can look at some of John Thompson films and the experimental videos that he's coming up with, quite creative. The Rumbles in the Bar, have you had a chance to view that one? If I show it to you, you might recognize it. But experimenting with editing and placement of the video and what you decide to emphasize, not emphasize. And again, using the iMovie software to produce these. The postings are countless. And so in the form of literature, I used to have to go face to face to see performances, but no longer do you have to do that. You have access to YouTube, but there's no feedback. The feedback is given to you based on how many likes you score on Facebook. So you do it in isolation, and the only way you get feedback is this count how many likes I get. And so things have changed and evolved as a result when it comes to ASL literature. This is not a judgment. Is it good or bad? It's a new way of approaching ASL literature. So in conclusion, to talk again about the value of ASL literature, going from exposure to nursery rhymes and patterns and movement all the way to learning more about the culture from within the culture, using literature as data for cultural studies. If you want to do research and find out what people are thinking and where we are as a society, look at literature. The data is there. You can look at it and discover a lot of information, a lot of ideas about what a deaf culture is, what the deaf experience is, via a study of literature. Like it says here in the quote, it's in literature that true life can be found. It's under the mask of fiction that you can tell the truth. I believe that it's there. And there's also a call for more. We need more. Just don't sit there and enjoy it, but make it, produce it. We need more. Thank you all.